What would you do if, in the middle of the night, a foreign voice demanded that you surrender your country in just 48 hours? Would you give in to protect your life, or would you risk everything for dignity? Can a single refusal truly stand against global power? And if one small nation dares to say no, what unstoppable force might be unleashed across an entire continent? At 3 o'clock in the morning, when most of the world was asleep, a phone rang in the heart of Africa. Not a bomb exploding, not an army invading, not even a protest on the street. Just the shrill cry of a phone in the dark. And yet that sound carried the weight of an entire nation's destiny. A voice from thousands of miles away gave an ultimatum: 48 hours. Restore the contracts, reinstate the surveillance programs, reverse your decisions, or you will be removed. Imagine that for a moment. Not a war, not a coup. Just a call meant to erase a president's will and bend a country back into submission. But here is the shock. That same phone call, designed to break a man, did the exact opposite. It ignited something no one expected. What was meant to topple a leader became the moment a continent found its voice. That is the contradiction, the mystery, and the reason why this story cannot be ignored. A threat that was supposed to silence one president instead awakened millions. How can one man, standing in the dead of night, refuse what so many others would accept? How can a single no echo louder than tanks, louder than money, louder than the fear of being destroyed? I still remember the first time I listened to the transcript of that conversation. The cold, sharp words from the foreign power cut through like a blade. They demanded obedience. They promised punishment. And in that moment, you would expect hesitation, calculation, maybe even surrender. But instead came words that shattered the silence. I do not negotiate with extortionists. I do not bow to bullies. I do not abandon my people. It felt less like a political answer and more like a human instinct, the primal refusal to give up dignity. Now let me step back. Most of us believe history is shaped by wars, treaties, elections, or revolutions. But sometimes history pivots on the smallest of things. A gesture, a sentence, a voice on the line. That night in Ouagadougou, it was not the roar of artillery or the collapse of a parliament. It was simply the decision of one man to hang up the phone. That choice, as small as it looked, would transform the fate of a nation and ripple across the globe. Why does this matter? Because it turns upside down what we thought we knew about power. Power is not always the loudest army, the richest treasury, or the strongest ally. Sometimes power is simply the courage to say no when everyone expects you to say yes. And courage, once revealed, spreads faster than fear. As I think about it, there is something almost cinematic about the scene. The stillness of night, the glow of a single desk lamp, the tension in the air so thick you could almost hear it. On one end of the line, a voice full of threats, certain that fear would do its work. On the other, a president with no nuclear weapons, no vast army, no guarantee of survival, only an unshakable belief that his people's dignity was not for sale. When he hung up, he was not just rejecting a deal. He was rejecting an entire world order built on intimidation. And that is why I call this the most dangerous phone call in modern history. Dangerous not because of what it threatened to take, but because of what it accidentally unleashed. When news of the ultimatum leaked, it did not cause panic. It caused fury. Crowds gathered, voices rose, signs declared, "We are not a colony." Suddenly, the ultimatum was no longer between two leaders. It was between an empire and an entire people. This is the paradox that still haunts me. If the foreign power had never called, perhaps none of this would have happened. Perhaps Burkina Faso would have remained in quiet struggle, unknown to most of the world. But that call, that single attempt to crush resistance, instead turned into the spark of a continental awakening. Sometimes the very tools of oppression create the resistance they seek to destroy. And so I invite you to follow me through this story. Because what began as a midnight threat turned into 48 hours that redefined an entire generation's view of sovereignty, pride, and courage. Do not look away. Do not dismiss this as distant politics. This is a tale about the cost of dignity and the question every people must answer. What happens when you say no and refuse to disappear? The video team warmly greets our viewers. Thank you for being here with us. If you believe stories like this must be told, if you want us to continue bringing you these narratives that reveal the hidden battles behind the headlines, please subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the strength to keep going, to dig deeper, and to share more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us what true courage looks like. What does it mean when the fate of a country is reduced to a single deadline, measured not in years or even months, but in just 48 hours? Can a nation survive such pressure, or is collapse inevitable? And if one leader refuses, what happens next? These are the questions that haunted me as I studied what unfolded in Burkina Faso during those 2 days that shook Africa. It is a story that sounds almost unbelievable, yet it is very real. A foreign prime minister made a call at 3 in the morning. The message was blunt: restore our contracts, reinstate our surveillance agreements, or prepare to be removed from power. The time given was 48 hours. In the eyes of the caller, it was supposed to be simple. A small landlocked country with no nuclear weapons, no massive economy, no global influence would surely bow. Most leaders in history, faced with such a demand, would have calculated the risks, weighed survival against pride, and quietly stepped aside. But not this time. I ask myself, why did Ibrahim Traore not yield? Why did he not take the easy road, sign the papers, keep his seat, and spare his people from hardship? Was it stubbornness, or was it something deeper? Something born from decades of African nations being told what to do, what to sell, and who should lead them? The truth is, his refusal was more than a political act. It was a test of whether dignity could still matter in a world where power is usually measured in dollars and guns. And here is where the story turns. The ultimatum was never meant to see the light of day. It was designed to stay hidden, a private warning in the shadows. But instead, the words spilled into the public. News spread across radios, television, and social media. The leader of a foreign government had given Burkina Faso's president a deadline to surrender. The reaction was not panic. It was outrage. Within hours, people filled the streets of the capital. Their signs did not plead for peace at any price. They demanded defiance. They shouted that their minerals were not for sale, their leaders not for replacement, their country not a colony. What fascinates me most is how quickly the narrative shifted. In less than 1 day, the question was no longer whether one man would fall. The question became whether a nation could stand. Imagine the shock in foreign capitals, watching the footage of thousands gathered outside the palace, chanting that 48 hours meant nothing compared to 48 years of resistance. This was not fear. It was fury transformed into unity. But another question lingers. What if Traoré had chosen differently? What if he had resigned quietly, handing over power to a figure more acceptable to outsiders? Would the people of Burkina Faso have accepted it? Or would history have simply recorded another silent surrender, another name on the list of leaders forced out by hidden hands? We will never know, because he chose the other path. He chose to gamble on the will of his people and on the possibility that saying no could spark something larger. That gamble revealed a hidden truth. Pressure can backfire. Threats can unite instead of divide. In this case, the 48-hour ultimatum exposed not weakness, but strength. It showed that even a small nation could force the world to look again, to question assumptions, to wonder what happens when a continent long dismissed as powerless suddenly decides enough is enough. So here is my challenge to you as a viewer. Think carefully about this moment. Do you believe power always lies with those who have the money, the technology, the armies? Or can true power come from a single refusal, amplified by millions of voices who refuse to bend? That is the heart of the story. It is not about contracts or surveillance agreements. It is about whether dignity has a place in global politics and whether a people, once awakened, can ever be silenced again. This is why I cannot stop revisiting those 2 days. They remind me that history is not always written by the strongest. Sometimes it is written by those who dare to resist. And in Burkina Faso, the clock ticking down from 48 hours became less a countdown to surrender and more the beginning of a movement no one could have predicted. It is a lesson worth remembering because the next time such a call is made, the answer may be very different. The question is, which path would you choose? Picture the scene. It is deep into the night in Ouagadougou. The streets are empty, the lamps flicker, the world is asleep. But inside the presidential office, the air is heavy. A single phone call has just delivered a demand that could end a presidency. Can you imagine what it feels like to hear a voice from another land tell you that you have 48 hours to surrender everything you stand for? No tanks, no soldiers, just a cold voice through the wire, confident that fear alone will do the work. The room is quiet after the call ends, but it is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a storm building. President Ibrahim Traore knows he cannot keep this to himself. He summons his most trusted ministers, the defense chief, the intelligence director, the foreign affairs advisor. They arrive groggy, some still in the clothes they slept in, faces tense as they take their seats around the long wooden table. He does not speak at first. Instead, he presses play. The recording of the call fills the room. The demands are unmistakable. Restore the contracts, reinstate the surveillance programs, hand over power if you refuse. When the tape stops, the silence is absolute. What do you say in a moment like that? The defense minister is the first to break it. His words are grave. This is not about business. This is regime change. The intelligence chief nods, adding that satellite activity has increased, cyber probes have been detected, and suspicious funds are moving into the region. They are preparing for something larger. The foreign advisor raises the possibility no one wants to voice. Resign, step down, and maybe they will let you leave alive. All eyes turn to Traoré. Without hesitation, he answers, "Never." I try to imagine the weight of that word in the room. Never. He walks to the map of Burkina Faso hanging on the wall. A small country, 22 million people, surrounded by uncertainty, without a powerful army, without the shield of nuclear weapons. And yet he points to it with a steady hand. We have only one thing, he says, the resolve not to bow down. At that moment, the question is no longer about contracts or power. It is about identity. What kind of nation do you become if you give in at the first threat? The image that stays with me is not of soldiers or weapons, but of that meeting room in the dead of night. Men and women sitting in silence, the hum of the ceiling fan, the faint glow of the map, and a president who has just chosen the path of resistance. Outside, the city is still calm. Vendors sleep, children dream, the world unaware of the storm about to break. But inside that room, history is shifting. And then comes the second phone call. The same voice, even clearer, as if to erase any doubt. 48 hours to leave your post. Hand power to someone who knows how to cooperate. Traoré does not wait this time. He cuts in firmly. I will not resign. I will not surrender. I will not abandon my people. He hangs up before the caller can finish. He feels no fear, only clarity. He orders his security chief to wake the council. Tonight, he says, we prepare for what is coming. I cannot help but ask myself, what gives a man the strength to reject such power? Was it faith in his people, in the possibility that they would stand with him? Or was it simply the refusal to let fear dictate his destiny? Either way, in that moment, the story changes. It is no longer a secret call in the night. It is the opening act of a confrontation that will soon spill into the streets, the airwaves, and the entire continent. This is how it begins. Not with explosions or tanks rolling across borders, but with a phone, a recording, a map on the wall, and a leader who decides that surrender is not an option. The scene is almost cinematic, yet it is true. And once you step into that room with him, once you hear those words, you realize that the countdown has already started, and the next 48 hours will decide not only his future, but the future of a people determined not to be erased. When I try to make sense of those 48 hours, one question always returns to me. Was Ibrahim Traore reckless, or was he calculating something others could not see? On the surface, his refusal looks like madness. He knew what was coming. The financial system could be crippled. The power grid could be disrupted. Foreign media would paint him as dangerous, authoritarian, or worse. Any logical strategist might have said, accept the demands, survive, and fight another day. But instead, he chose confrontation. Why? Here is where the paradox lies. By standing firm, he invited every kind of assault short of open invasion. Yet by the very act of refusing, he gained something no amount of contracts or deals could buy. He gained legitimacy in the eyes of his people. And legitimacy, once rooted in the streets, is more difficult to topple than any palace guard. The ultimatum, meant to isolate him, instead placed the entire nation on his side. When ordinary citizens heard that a foreign government believed it could choose their leader, they did not collapse into despair. They rose with anger. They stood outside the palace, shouting that their country was not for sale. That is a kind of power you cannot purchase, only provoke. But let us imagine the alternative. What if he had resigned? Perhaps Burkina Faso would have avoided cyber attacks, economic strain, and the brutal glare of international pressure. Perhaps aid would have continued to flow, contracts restored, investors reassured. Yet at what cost? His people would have seen surrender, not survival. They would have learned once again that dignity comes last, comfort comes first, and that leaders bend when pushed. What would that have done to the soul of the nation? Sometimes the more dangerous road is the one that looks safe in the moment. And here is the deeper point. In the modern world, wars are often not fought with bullets, but with narratives. What was truly at stake was not only Traoré's position, but the idea of African sovereignty itself. When foreign headlines began to describe him as authoritarian, when fabricated videos circulated showing him fleeing, when bank documents were forged with his name, the real target was not the man. It was the belief that an African leader could say no and survive. If that belief were broken, it would send a message to every other capital across the continent. Resist, and you will fall. But if it held, if even one nation endured, then the opposite message would spread. Resist, and you might awaken something larger than yourself. So which was the greater risk? To bow and maintain the illusion of stability, or to stand firm and risk chaos? Traoré chose the second. Critics might call it stubbornness, but I see it as a wager on history. He gambled that the courage of a single act could outweigh the suffering of sanctions and propaganda. He gambled that his people, when tested, would choose pride over panic. And remarkably, he was right. Instead of being overthrown, he was lifted. Instead of being silenced, his defiance was amplified across borders. The irony is hard to ignore. The very tools meant to destroy him created his shield. The disinformation campaigns collapsed when citizens themselves debunked them in real time. The cyber attacks meant to paralyze only exposed the country's resilience. And the threats of isolation produced the opposite effect, drawing in unexpected alliances from neighbors who realized that if he fell, they could be next. The attempt to weaken him inadvertently forged continental unity. That is the unintended consequence of coercion. Sometimes force backfires, not because the target is strong, but because the method exposes its own arrogance. This is the lesson I take from those nights. True strength is not always in avoiding the storm. Sometimes it is in refusing to close the door when the storm comes. Traoré had no guarantee of survival, yet his refusal created a narrative more powerful than any weapon. It was the story that dignity, once defended, multiplies. And that is what foreign powers overlooked. You can pressure a government, but if you pressure a people, you might awaken something you cannot control. So I ask you, which choice would you have made? Would you have stepped aside to preserve comfort, or would you have risked everything for a principle no one can touch? That is the heart of this story, and that is why it still matters. Because the question is not only about one man in Ouagadougou. It is about all of us. When faced with an ultimatum, do we bend to survive the moment, or do we stand to define the future? The clock struck the 48th hour, and the world held its breath. For 2 days, threats had poured in, cyber attacks had hit, foreign headlines had smeared, and yet Ibrahim Traore had not moved. What would happen when the deadline expired? Would soldiers appear at the palace gates? Would the economy collapse in real time? Would fear finally crack the unity of the streets? These were the questions that hovered as dusk fell over Ouagadougou. And then he stepped out. No papers in his hand, no teleprompter, no protective shield of glass. Just his voice and the sight of hundreds of thousands filling the avenues as far as the eye could see. Imagine the sound of that crowd. It was not nervous. It was not fragile. It was thunder. He raised his hand, and they fell silent. Then came the words that would echo far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. 48 hours ago, he told them, a foreign leader demanded my resignation. Tonight, I stand before you still your president. You are still free, and this land still belongs to its people. The truth is shocking in its simplicity. A call meant to erase a leader instead birthed a new doctrine. Out of that standoff emerged the Ouagadougou Protocol, a pledge among nations that any attempt to destabilize one government would be treated as an attack on all. It was not militarism. It was unity written into law. For the first time, African leaders spoke with one voice and declared that the age of ultimatums was over. Think about the irony. What began as an effort to silence one man ended as the catalyst for an entire continent's awakening. But here is what fascinates me most. The impact did not stop with diplomats or ministers. It seeped into the fabric of daily life. On buses, people played recordings of his balcony speech. In schools, children recited the story of the 48 hours as a lesson in sovereignty. In homes, grandparents whispered with pride that this time, unlike before, they had not sold out. Can you see the shift? It was not only a political survival, it was a cultural rebirth. Still, the cost was real. Aid projects were frozen, accounts were locked, growth slowed. Critics abroad pointed to the risks of defiance. But inside the country, something more valuable grew. Pride. And pride, once awakened, is not easily put back to sleep. The finance minister captured it perfectly when he said it is better to walk slowly with dignity than to run in humiliation. That is not a slogan. That is a worldview. Now let us look forward. Out of this crisis came projects once thought impossible, plans for a continental currency designed to shield economies from outside pressure. A communications satellite launched by African engineers meant to reduce dependence on foreign surveillance. Fiber optic cables linking capitals directly, so conversations no longer had to travel through servers on another continent. And perhaps most telling, the African Leadership Academy in Kampala, where the most popular course was titled the 48-Hour Protocol. Students there studied not just what happened, but why it mattered, training themselves to be ready for the next ultimatum long before it arrived. So what does this mean for the rest of us? Can we dismiss it as a local story, confined to one small nation? Or do we see in it the outline of a larger shift? What happens when people who were once expected to obey discover that they can resist and still stand? What happens when dignity becomes a force stronger than fear? These questions reach far beyond Burkina Faso. They touch every society that has ever faced the pressure to conform, to surrender, to trade principle for safety. I leave you with this thought. Threats are powerful only when you believe them. Dignity is powerful because it needs no belief. It exists the moment you act on it. That is the real lesson of the 48 hours. A continent that had long been told it must accept terms was suddenly reminded that it could set its own. And once that memory is restored, the world can never be the same. So I ask you, the listener, if you were in that square at the 48th hour, would you have chosen silence or defiance? Would you have begged your leader to bow? Or would you have stood shoulder to shoulder chanting that 48 hours is nothing compared to 48 years of pride? The answer to that question will shape not just the future of one nation, but the story of how we all define freedom in the years to come. When I look back on the story of those 48 hours in Burkina Faso, what strikes me most is not just the drama of a midnight phone call or the roar of a crowd filling the streets. What lingers is the clarity of a choice. A foreign leader believed he could topple a president with a threat delivered through a telephone line. He believed fear would do the work that armies once did. And for a moment, the outcome seemed predictable. Yet what happened instead was something far more powerful. One man's refusal became the spark for an entire nation's awakening. A people who had been told for generations to accept decisions made elsewhere suddenly discovered that they could stand, that they could say no, and still endure. The deeper lesson here is that power is not always about size or wealth. Power can be the courage to stand firm when the world expects you to kneel. Traoré had no guarantee that he would survive, no certainty that his people would rally, no assurance that allies would step forward. But by refusing to bow, he revealed a truth that has repeated throughout history. When dignity is defended openly, it has a way of multiplying. One act of courage can turn into 1,000 acts of support. And that is exactly what happened as citizens filled the squares and neighbors across Africa declared that an attack on one was an attack on all. This is not only a story about geopolitics, it is also a story about how we live our lives. Every one of us will face moments when the pressure to conform, to submit, or to give up our principles feels overwhelming. Sometimes it is at work, sometimes in relationships, sometimes in the choices we make for our future. The temptation to surrender for the sake of comfort can be strong. But the story of those 48 hours reminds us that choosing dignity, even at a cost, can lead to strength we did not know we had. From my perspective, the real victory of Burkina Faso was not that the president stayed in office. The real victory was that ordinary people realized their voices mattered, that they were part of a collective decision to stand together. That is what transformed a fragile state into a symbol of pride. In our own lives, the same principle applies. When we act with integrity, when we refuse to compromise on what truly matters, we may face challenges in the short term. But in the long term, we gain something much more valuable: self-respect, trust, and the knowledge that we did not betray ourselves. So what is the lesson for us today? It is simple. Threats, whether from powerful voices abroad or from fears inside our own hearts, only hold power if we believe them. Dignity, once chosen, cannot be taken away. In a world that often pressures us to bend, the ability to stand firm may be the most revolutionary act of all. What about you? Do you believe that holding on to dignity, even when it costs you something, is worth more than temporary comfort? Please feel free to share your perspective in the comments so others can reflect and learn from your thoughts. And if you found value in this story and want to hear more, please subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to continue creating meaningful content for you.